Hey, Cinch. This is Professor Gore. Sorry that last part got cut off. I was expecting a conference call about 5 minutes later, and they called a little earlier, and so I got off the phone, got off the lecture real quick, so I could take that phone call. So this is supposed to be the rest of part two, so we'll call it part three. But this is going to be about slave revolts and so forth with the slave trade and so forth. All right. So we looked at this image kind of right as I got cut off and showing you how many millions came over from West Africa and so forth. And I want to kind of emphasize that warfare and slaving had been an integral part of African life for centuries. That slavery had been existent in West Africa and other parts of Africa long before the European slave trade. But it increases and intensifies rapidly as a result. And it's because of the demand for sugar cultivation and so forth. Slaving wars also increased in scale, and really they became a favorite tactic of ambitious kings and plundering warlords. For instance, the West African kingdom of Dahomey, which we talk about in world history, included a contingent of about 5,000 women who raided the interior for captives. Between 1680 and 1730, these raids accounted for many of the 20,000 slaves exported annually from Alada and Whydah. The trade in humans produced untold misery because oftentimes they brand them at the coast, which is really as if the Middle Passage wasn't bad enough. Now you got to deal with a terrible burn on your shoulder or leg or something. And one of the things that you'll see is about 2/3 of those who were sent were men. And like I said previously, it changed the marriage culture of Africa as it led to more polygamy. Surprisingly, the population doesn't decline in Africa; it stabilizes, and that's because of the introduction of the potato, both the regular like russet potato and particularly sweet potato. It increases the population and birth rates. Um, at the height of his power, Sultan Maui Ismail of Morocco owned about 150,000 black slaves in Morocco. So you had tremendous slavery that was taking place in different parts of Africa. You never had a plantation over that 150,000 black slaves by himself, and that was obtained by trade with the city of Timbuktu, and um, uh, and by force when he invaded Senegal and so forth. And so in Africa, as in the Americas, slavery was eroding the dignity of human life. Okay. Now, let's look at one of the things is the emergence of an African American community and so forth that develops. And we're gonna talk about slave revolts here at the end of this as well. But slaves came from many different states and peoples in West Africa and in the West Central African regions of Congo and Angola. Plantation owners in South Carolina preferred laborers from the Gold Coast and Gambia, who had a reputation as hardworking farmers. But as soon as African sources of slaves shifted southward after 1730, more than 30,000 of the colony's workforce came from the Congo, excuse me, and Angola. Angola was a big kingdom on the West African coast, or kind of more the south central western aspect of Africa. Some white planters welcome ethnic diversity as a deterrent to slave revolts. So, for instance, that way they wouldn't speak the same language. Of the slaves imported into the Upper James River region of Virginia after 1730, 41% embarked from ports in the Bight of Biafra, present day Nigeria, as well as Kiowa dialects were spoken. Another 25% came from West Central Africa and were probably Kakongo and Kimbundi speakers. The rest hailed from the Windward and Gold Coast, Senegambia, and Sierra Leone, and spoke Mandan and other regional languages. Initially, the slaves did not think of themselves as Africans or blacks, but as members of a specific family, clan, or people, and they associated with those who shared their language and customs. Slaves typically married within their clan or family when they arrived in America. Over time, the slaves made friendships and married across ethnic lines, thereby transcending the cultural groups of their homeland. Well, and that's because of the environment they were put in. In the West Indies and Carolina lowlands, African-born people created new languages such as Gula that developed, and it really was, or it was, if they didn't speak Gula, they also spoke English or French. Now, Gula was a new language that developed that kind of blended African languages so that African slaves of different tribal groups that spoke different languages could communicate. It's very smart. We're kind of learning more about the Gula language in history in the last 20 years or so. just because we have a lot of historical record about it. So, um, one of the things is a nearly equal number of men and women in British North America, which encourage marriage. So that's why one of the reasons why the population increases. The death rates aren't as bad in British North America. The work is not as bad as sugar plantations, and there was more women that were reported as well. Um, and so that created more stable families and continuity between generations as well. After 1725, the Chesapeake area blacks created strong nuclear families and extended kin relationships. These African Americans gradually developed a culture of their own, passing on family names, traditions, and knowledge to the next generation. As the slaves formed a new identity, they carried on certain African practices but let others go. Some slaves retained Muslim religious beliefs, and many more relied on the spiritual powers of Obe, these conjurers who knew the way of the African gods, which is basically a priest. Until the 1790s, few slaves became Christians. Now, in the Second Great Awakening, as we'll learn later in this course, the vast majority of African Americans are going to become Christians, but that'll happen from the 1790s into the early 1800s. Okay. Now, what about resistance? You think that some are going to resist? Absolutely. Now, if we're world history, we would talk about a little more in depth about slave revolts in South America. There were a lot of runaway slaves that developed maroon communities in the Caribbean. In fact, they would raid plantations. Eventually, plantation owners had to create a peace agreement with the maroon communities and so forth to keep them from stealing their slaves and causing violence and so forth. Very few were educated. Okay, and that'll be a common trend. You will see later in the 1800s more will be educated, but few were. They accumulated few material goods and had little opportunity to weave cloth or decorate pottery with traditional African designs. Slaves who resisted did so at their peril. Planters resorted to the lash to punish slaves who refused to work. Some would amputate slaves' fingers, toes, or ears if they continued to run away. Particularly those that ran away, they would cut off part of their foot. Ugh. Masters raised their children to often be tyrants themselves, as Thomas Jefferson recounted on his own father's plantation. The extent of white violence depended on the size and density of the slave population. In the rural areas of the northern colonies, there were very few slaves, and physical violence was sporadic and not as much. But assertive black slaves on the sugar and rice plantations of the West Indies and South Carolina were routinely whipped to keep them in line because the work was so backbreaking. And because Africans outnumbered Europeans 8-1 in these plantation areas, planters prohibited slaves from leaving the plantation without special passes. Slaves dealt with their plight in several ways. Some newly arrived Africans fled to the frontier. In fact, Florida had a lot of runaway slaves that were there. In fact, a lot of them intermarried with Creeks and Seminole Indians and so forth. And later, when Andrew Jackson's army goes down to Florida, they're surprised at how many blacks and mixed race people that are there because of the amount of runaways. So a lot of them fled to the frontier. Some of them that didn't reproduce, when they died off, didn't have any children. So it's difficult to know how many escaped to the frontier. We do know that many did. Probably a small percentage, really, but we know that many did, just from accounts of the slave owner. Now, some of them were able, when they escaped to the frontier, they would create traditional villages or married to Indian tribes. As I mentioned, a lot of the Creeks intermarried. Blacks who were fluent in English fled to towns where they tried to pass as free men and women, because there's going to be an increasing number of free blacks, both in the North and South, as U.S. history progresses. Most Africans remained enslaved and bargained continually with their masters over the terms of their bondage. Some blacks bartered extra work for better food and clothes. Others seized a small privilege and dared the master to revoke it. Sundays eventually became a day of rest. When bargaining failed, slaves would protest silently, working slowly, or they would steal, they would damage equipment. Some of them rose up and killed their owners or overseers. These events occurred in Amherst County, Virginia in the 1760s, as well as Elizabeth City County in Virginia as well. South Carolina witnessed the largest slave uprising, the Stono Rebellion, in 1739. All right, so about 250 insurrections that we have known that were documented between 1780 and 1864, and that was after the American Revolution. But what about the ones that were before that? It's difficult to know. There was one in near a Spanish settlement in the mouth of the Petey River in South Carolina in 1526. That one happened before Jamestown. Okay, but Stono County Rebellion was the biggest slave revolt before the American Revolution. And so what ends up happening is they slaughter their slave family, and they're fleeing towards Georgia. A lot of runaway slaves went to Georgia, but they had trouble getting across the river to get into Georgia, and they were in the process of building a flotation device or a raft to get across when they were actually captured by slave owners. And about 40 black slaves were end up being killed, and the rebellion was suppressed. But it is pretty bad. About 75 Africans rose in revolt, killed about 20 or so estimated, but the white militia eventually caught up with them, and it was very close to being successful. They got to cut across the river; they would have been free. Okay. After about the 1660s, you began seeing slave codes and laws that were put into place. Some areas prevented them from learning how to read and write. Some areas weren't like that. They were supposed to stay on the plantation unless they had a special pass. Slaves were not allowed to congregate after dark because they thought they might revolt. They were not allowed to possess any firearm, particularly in places like South Carolina. There was a larger black population than white population. And here's a lot of the main crops in South Carolina. They're growing indigo to the left, rice to the right, and then tobacco in the Chesapeake colonies. All right, we'll come to colonial society and so forth in the last part.